My name is Nadia, and I was 31 years old when my mother told me, from a hospital waiting room 2 states away, that my sister needed her more than I did. I was the one in the hospital bed. I'd just been pulled from a car that had been struck at an intersection, my collarbone was fractured, and I had called my parents because I needed someone to come and sit with my newborn daughter while I was being treated. My mother's exact words were, "Your sister needs us more right now, Nadia. You've always been the one who handles things." I didn't argue. I thanked her. I hung up, and I asked a nurse to call my neighbor instead. But something shifted in me that afternoon. Not loudly. More like a door closing somewhere far back in a house you thought you knew. Because I had been wiring my parents $3,500 every single month for 6 years, for my father's heart medication, for his treatment plan, for the follow-up appointments my mother said the insurance wouldn't cover. And I had never once asked to see a receipt. What I found when I finally did ask, and who was in the room when it came out, is something I still think about every time I drive past that bank branch. I grew up in a house where the word responsible was used the way some families use beloved. It wasn't a compliment, exactly. It was more of an assignment. Nadia is the responsible one. Nadia will figure it out. Nadia doesn't need as much as your sister does. I heard that last sentence so many times growing up that by the time I was a teenager, I had stopped registering it as a slight. It was simply the weather of our household, the prevailing condition, neither questioned nor changed. My sister Renata is 3 years younger than me, and I want to be careful about how I describe her, because this story is not really about Renata. She was not calculating in the way that the word villain implies. She was, more accurately, someone who had learned very early that if she expressed need loudly enough and often enough, the need would be met. And our parents had learned, just as early, that I would absorb whatever Renata couldn't carry. That was the arrangement. No one had ever written it down or said it plainly, but it was as binding as any contract I've ever signed. I left our hometown of Millhaven, a mid-sized city in the inland part of the state, when I was 22. I had a degree in supply chain logistics and a job offer from a regional distribution company that I had earned through 2 internships and a great deal of being the only person in the room willing to stay until the work was finished. Within 4 years, I had been promoted twice, relocated to a larger office in the metro area, and was earning a salary that would have seemed surreal to the version of me who had grown up sharing a bedroom with Renata and eating dinner at a table where money was always the fourth, unspoken guest. I was not extravagant with what I earned. I drove a sensible car. I rented an apartment that was comfortable but not showy. I wore good clothes, but I bought them on sale. I saved carefully, and I gave generously, because generosity was the one inherited trait from my parents that I had no interest in unlearning. My parents had always given to the community, to the church, to neighbors in need. The form of giving had been modeled for me, even if some of the recipients, I would later learn, had been poorly chosen. The call about my father's heart came when I was 27. I had just gotten home from a 12-hour shift during a particularly brutal quarter-end crunch. It was late autumn. I remember the light in my apartment, the orange of the street lamps coming through the blinds, the particular quiet of a weeknight when you are too tired to turn on music, but also too wired to sleep. My phone rang, and it was my mother. She said my father had been diagnosed with a condition called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, a thickening of the heart muscle that could, in its more severe forms, require ongoing medication management, regular monitoring, and in some cases, procedures that insurance did not fully cover. She was calm when she told me this. She was always calm. That was one of her gifts, the ability to deliver information that should produce panic in a tone that suggested everything was already handled. You just needed to help with one small piece. The one small piece, she explained, was the out-of-pocket gap. His insurance covered the primary care visits and the major procedures. What it didn't cover, she said, was the ongoing medication regimen, a combination of drugs that had to be adjusted regularly, plus the specialist copays, plus the dietary supplements his cardiologist had recommended. She had done the math, she said. It came to roughly $3,000 a month. Maybe a little more in months when he needed an echocardiogram. I said I would help. I did not say how much or for how long, or can I see the breakdown. I said I would help because that was the word that fit the shape of who I had been trained to be. I set up a monthly wire transfer, $3,500, the extra $500 a cushion for the echo months, and I noted it in my budget the way you note a utility. Fixed. Necessary. Unquestioned. That was the beginning. I want to tell you about Grandpa Gerald before we go any further, because he matters to what happens later, and because he was one of the few people in my family's orbit who treated me as though I were fully present in a room even when I wasn't saying anything. Gerald was my father's father. He was 78 when this story begins, a retired civil engineer who had spent his career working on municipal infrastructure projects across the state. He was not a warm man in the way that some grandfathers are described. He didn't give bear hugs or tell rambling stories at the dinner table. He was precise. He listened more than he spoke. And when he did speak, it was usually to say something that took you a moment to understand, and then stayed with you for a long time. He had watched me grow up. He had watched the dynamic in our family with the expression of a man who has identified a flaw in a load-bearing wall and is waiting to see how long it takes everyone else to notice. He never said anything directly to me about it when I was young. But he would find reasons to be around when I accomplished things. He would show up to my college graduation when my own parents arrived late because Renata had a dance recital the same weekend. He would send a card when I got my promotions, brief and specific. You earned that. Don't let anyone else carry the credit. In the years after I began the wire transfers, Gerald and I had developed a habit of speaking on the phone every few weeks. He never asked about the money directly, but once, maybe 8 months into the arrangement, he said something that lodged in me. Nadia, you trust the people you love. Just make sure they've earned it in the same currency you're spending.
I didn't know what to do with that then.
I filed it somewhere and kept wiring the money. My daughter Petra was born when I was 29, the product of a relationship that had ended amicably and quietly 6 months into my pregnancy. Her father, Marco, was a decent man who lived on the other side of the country and who was present in Petra's life through weekend calls and carefully scheduled visits. He paid his support without drama. We were not a love story that had failed. We were two people who had cared for each other and then grown in directions that no longer overlapped. I do not speak about him here with anything other than respect. Raising Petra mostly alone while working full-time required a level of logistical precision that I was, fortunately, professionally trained for. I built systems. I had a trusted neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Dolores, who could take Petra on short notice. I had a daycare arrangement that I had researched exhaustively. I had a calendar that looked, to an outside observer, like a project management chart for a small corporation. And every month, quietly and without comment, $3,500 left my account and went to Millhaven. The first sign looking back was a photograph. Renata posted it on her social media page on a Thursday evening in the spring of my 4th year of payments. It was a picture of her and my parents on the deck of a cruise ship, one of the large ones, the kind with multiple pools and a formal dining room. My mother was wearing a dress I had never seen before, pale blue with embroidery at the collar, and my father looked relaxed in a way I had not seen since before his diagnosis. They were smiling. The caption read, "Family time, long overdue. So grateful." I looked at it for a moment. I noted something tighten slightly in my chest. Then I told myself the story I had been telling myself for 4 years, that people with chronic health conditions deserved rest, that stress was genuinely dangerous for someone managing a heart condition, that my parents had probably saved carefully for this trip, that the medication and treatment were the fixed costs, and a vacation was something separate. I told myself that story, and I kept wiring the money. The second sign came 6 months later, when I called my father to ask whether we should revisit the amount now that Petra had started full-time daycare and my monthly expenses had increased. My father said, "Nadia, the medication hasn't gotten cheaper. You know how it is." His voice was the same voice it had always been when he wanted to communicate that a conversation was over. Measured. Final. Not unkind. Exactly, but not open to discussion. I said I understood. I kept wiring the money. The third sign came from Grandpa Gerald. He had been to visit my parents for a week in the summer, and when he called me afterward, there was a quality to his pauses that I had learned to read over the years. He asked me how I was doing. He asked about Petra. And then he said, almost as an aside, "Your father seemed well. Did the new car help his back? He mentioned something about the seat adjustments. I said I didn't know about a new car. Gerald said he had assumed I knew, since I was the one who, and then he stopped himself, and the pause was long enough to have its own weight. He said, "Never mind. Tell Petra I said hello." I thought about that pause for a week. I turned it over the way you turn a stone over, without quite deciding to pick it up. But I didn't pull the records.
Not yet.
Because the fourth sign had not happened yet, and it was the one that broke something open in me that I couldn't close again. I was 31 when the accident happened. Petra was 14 months old. I had taken her to an early morning pediatric appointment, and we were on our way home in the light mid-morning traffic when a driver ran a red light and struck the driver's side of my car at approximately 40 miles per hour. The airbag deployed. The car was destroyed. I was conscious throughout. Petra, in her rear-facing seat, was physically unharmed, the safety engineering held, and the side that was struck was mine. I was taken by ambulance to the regional hospital. My collarbone was fractured in 2 places. I had bruising across my left side that the ER physician described as extensive, and I had a mild concussion that required observation. I was not in mortal danger, but I was also not in a position to care for a 14-month-old for the next several days. I called my mother from the hospital bed, with Petra sitting in a borrowed crib in the corner of my room, uncertain and fussing softly, because Dolores was visiting her daughter in another city and Marco was on the opposite coast. My mother answered on the second ring. I explained what had happened. I kept my voice even. I told her I was going to be fine, but that I needed someone to come and take Petra while I recovered. The drive was 4 hours. I said I would pay for the gas for a hotel if they needed it, whatever made it easier. There was a silence. And then my mother said, "Oh, Nadia. We're in the middle of something with Renata right now. She's having a really hard week. You know she's been struggling. Your father, and I really can't leave her alone right now. You understand. You've always been so capable." I said, "Mom, I have a fractured collarbone and a 14-month-old. She said, "I know, sweetheart. But Renata really needs us right now. You can call your neighbor, can't you? You always figure things out." I told her I would figure it out. I hung up, and in the quiet of that hospital room, with Petra watching me from the borrowed crib and the monitors making their small sounds, something in me went completely still. Not angry, not sad.
Still.
The way a room goes still when the last sound in it has finally finished echoing. I called Dolores's daughter, who was gracious enough to drive Dolores back that same afternoon. I arranged everything from a hospital bed, with one functioning arm. I was discharged 2 days later. I managed. And then, for the first time in 6 years, I asked myself a question I had somehow avoided asking. What is my money actually paying for? I want to be precise about what I did next because I think precision matters here. I didn't act in anger. I didn't call my parents and accuse them of anything. I simply, quietly, gathered information. I treated it like a work problem, which, in a way, it was. I was a logistics professional. I understood documentation, and I understood what it meant when documentation was absent. The first thing I did, from my couch with my arm in a sling, was log into my bank's online portal and export every outgoing wire transfer I had made in the previous 6 years. I created a spreadsheet. Date, amount, receiving account. It took me about 40 minutes. The total was $252,000. $252,000 in $41 payments of exactly $3,500 plus 4 additional payments of $4,000 for months when my mother had mentioned echo appointments. I looked at that number for a long time. Then I opened a new tab and looked up the average monthly cost of managing hypertrophic cardiomyopathy with medication. I cross-referenced it with the medication names my mother had mentioned over the years. The numbers I found were nowhere near $3,500 a month. They were closer to $400 to $600 a month for a well-managed case, even accounting for specialist visits and the occasional procedure. With insurance covering primary care and major interventions, the realistic out-of-pocket gap was a fraction of what I had been sending. I called Grandpa Gerald that evening. I didn't accuse anyone. I simply told him what I had found, and I asked him directly what he had been going to say this summer. He mentioned the car. There was a silence. And then Gerald said, Nadia, your father drives a very nice car. Your mother redid the kitchen 2 years ago. I didn't say anything because I thought you knew what you were contributing to. I assumed it was an arrangement you'd agreed to. I told him it was not an arrangement I had agreed to. Not in those terms. Gerald was quiet for another moment. And then he said, I have some documents I've been holding for a while. I think it's time you came to see me. What Gerald had were bank statements. Not my parents, he didn't have those. What he had were copies of several checks he had personally written to my father over the years for legitimate medical expenses, with notation on each one specifying the purpose. He had kept them because Gerald kept everything. It was the civil engineer in him, the instinct to document load-bearing decisions. And what those checks showed, cross-referenced with the dates of the procedures they were meant to cover, was that the major cardiac events had been paid for by Gerald, by the insurance, by my father's own savings. The gap that my mother had described to me, the gap I had been filling for 6 years, was a gap she had defined. I sat in Gerald's kitchen. He lived in a retirement community about 90 minutes from me, in a clean, spare apartment full of blueprints and orderly bookshelves, and I read through everything he had. I didn't cry. Something in my jaw was very tight and my hands were cold on the paper, but I didn't cry. Gerald made coffee. He sat across from me while I read, and when I looked up he said, I should have said something sooner. I thought you knew. I told him I understood why he hadn't. Families find ways to make their arrangements seem normal until they don't. He nodded. He said, What are you going to do? I said, I didn't know yet, but I was going to stop the transfers. And I was going to talk to a banking attorney about my options regarding documentation. Gerald put his hand on the table between us, not touching my hand, just close to it, and said, Whatever you decide. I'll be there if you need a witness. That word, witness, stayed with me on the drive home. The occasion that brought my entire family into the same room was my parents' 40th wedding anniversary. My mother had been planning it for over a year. It was held at the Hartwell Garden Club, a private event space about 20 minutes from my parents' home in Millhaven, a graceful, wood-paneled room with tall windows that looked out over a maintained garden, rented for an afternoon lunch reception. There were approximately 40 guests, extended family, longtime neighbors, members of my parents' church, a few of my father's former colleagues from the insurance firm where he had worked for most of his career. My parents had not mentioned to me that the event was partially funded by a loan they had requested from Renata's fiancé's family, a detail I would learn only later. What I knew walking in was that this was the most public gathering my family had convened in years. Everyone who mattered to them was in that room. I had debated for several weeks whether to attend at all. The banking attorney I had consulted, a methodical woman named Ellen Marsh who worked out of a small office near my apartment and who had reviewed my transfer records with the expression of someone who is not surprised but is still disappointed in the species, had advised me to continue attending family events normally. Do nothing unusual, she said. Don't telegraph what you're doing. The most useful thing you can do right now is be present and unremarkable while the documentation is assembled. I had followed her advice. I had RSVP'd yes to the anniversary lunch. I had arranged for Dolores to take Petra for the afternoon. I had bought a card. I had ironed a dress that was appropriate for the occasion, but not memorable. What I had not done was tell anyone, including my parents, that I had already, 3 weeks earlier, closed the wire transfer account. Not with drama. I had simply walked into my bank branch on a quiet weekday morning, spoken to the personal banking advisor, and converted the account back to a standard savings account in my name only, removing my parents' linked receiving information. I had asked for a certified statement of all transfers over the account's history. I had paid the small administrative fee for the documentation package. I had thanked the advisor and driven home. The transfers had simply stopped. My mother had called twice in the week since. The first call had been a general check-in, her tone pleasantly neutral in the way that suggests someone is waiting to see whether you'll raise a subject first. The second call had asked, with studied casualness, whether there was anything going on with the account. I had said I was looking into a few things and would be in touch. She had not pushed. I arrived at the Hartwell Garden Club 20 minutes before the reception began. I parked in the gravel lot and sat in my car for a moment, watching guests arrive in small groups. Neighbors in bright dresses. My father's old colleague Warren, who I had always liked, helping his wife up the front steps. Renata, arriving with her fiancé, turned once toward the parking lot and caught sight of my car. Something moved across her face too quickly for me to read, and then she turned away. Grandpa Gerald arrived 11 minutes after I did, walking steadily with his wooden cane. He was wearing a dark blazer and a tie I recognized from my college graduation. Under his arm, pressed flat and neat, was a manila folder. We had spoken the night before. He had confirmed he would be there. He had said, "I'll bring what I have. The rest is up to you." I met him at the door. We walked in together. My mother's face, when she saw us, did something complicated. It cycled through welcome and pleasure, and then landed on something that was careful.
Contained.
She kissed my cheek and told me I looked well. She told Gerald he was a sight for sore eyes. Her hands, when she touched his arm, had a very slight tremor that I do not think was medical. My father shook Gerald's hand. He was wearing a new suit, well cut, clearly recent, and he looked, as he always had, like a man who was comfortable being at the center of attention. He looked healthy. He looked relaxed. His color was good. His grip was firm. I took my seat at a round table near the center of the room, beside a woman from my parents' church named Harriet, who had known me since I was small, and who greeted me with genuine warmth. Gerald sat one table over, the manila folder tucked under his chair. The first hour of the reception was precisely what it was designed to be. Toasts were given. My mother dabbed at her eyes on cue. Renata stood up and gave a speech about what it meant to have parents who sacrificed everything for their children, and several people at her table nodded and reached for their napkins, and I listened to every word with my hands folded in my lap and my face arranged into an expression that was attentive and warm. And then, because events have their own logic, it came time for the open floor portion of the celebration, a segment my mother had included specifically to allow guests to share memories. Warren went first, a warm story about my father's early days in insurance. Two others followed. And then Harriet, beside me, leaned over and said, "Nadia, you should say something. You're their daughter. The room wants to hear from you." Several heads turned. My mother caught my eye from across the room, and in her expression I saw something that was part hope and part warning. I excused myself from my chair. I stood. The room settled. I want to be honest about what I said and how I said it. I did not stand up with the intention of a performance. What I had was a set of facts that had been sitting in me for several months, and I had decided some time ago that if the moment arose, if I was in a room with witnesses, and someone gave me a reason to speak clearly, I would speak clearly. Without theater. Without cruelty. Without anything that would later embarrass me. I thanked everyone for being there. I said 40 years was a remarkable thing, and that I meant that genuinely commitment across 4 decades is real. I said I had been reflecting lately on what it meant to support a family, and on how that support worked, and on what we owe each other when the accounting is finally done. My mother's expression had shifted into something that was very still. I said, "For the past 6 years, I wired money to my parents every month for my father's heart treatment. $3,500 a month. I want to say, for the record, that I did that willingly, out of love, and I would do it again, if that were what the money had been used for." The room was very quiet. The particular quality of quiet that comes when 40 people stop their private conversations simultaneously. My father said, from his seat, "Nadia." Just the one word. A warning in a single syllable. I said, "I'm just sharing some thoughts, Dad. That's what this portion of the program is for." I nodded to Grandpa Gerald. Gerald reached under his chair and retrieved the manila folder. He did not stand. He was 78 and his knees had been difficult that year, and standing at length wasn't comfortable for him. He simply opened the folder on the table in front of him and said, in his precise, carrying voice, the voice of a man who had spent a career presenting findings to municipal boards, "I'd like to add something, if I may." The room turned toward him. People like Gerald, calm, old, clearly not performing anything, command attention differently than emotion does. The room didn't just go quiet. It leaned in. Gerald explained, methodically, what he had documented. He had personal records of payments he had made directly toward my father's legitimate cardiac care over the past 6 years. He had 3 letters from the relevant medical providers, which he had obtained by the simple means of being a direct family member who requested copies of billing records. He had a chart. Gerald always had a chart showing the documented medical expenses per year against the amount I had been sending monthly. He did not characterize it. He did not use the word fraud or theft or any word that would have introduced legal terminology into a social occasion. He simply read the columns aloud. The documented medical cost per year, the amount wired per year, the gap per year, and then the total. The documented gap, Gerald said, in the same tone he might have used to describe a variance in a drainage calculation, over 6 years, is approximately $218,000. Warren, my father's former colleague, had placed his fork down during Gerald's summary and was now sitting very straight in his chair, looking at my father with an expression that had traveled some distance from celebration. Harriet's hand, beside me, had come up to her mouth. Renata had gone a color that was close to the color of the tablecloth, a kind of institutional beige. My mother was sitting with her back perfectly straight and her eyes on the centerpiece, which was a low arrangement of garden flowers, and her hands in her lap, and a stillness in her face that was different from composure. It was the stillness of someone who has no remaining move to make. My father said, "This isn't the place." Gerald said calmly, "You're right. It isn't. But Nadia asked me to bring the folder." I said, "Thank you, Grandpa." And then I sat down. I did not gloat. I did not look at my parents with any expression that was designed to communicate triumph. I smoothed the front of my dress. I picked up my water glass and I took a sip. My hands were completely steady. The room did the rest. The remainder of the anniversary reception lasted approximately 25 more minutes. It did not end dramatically. There was no confrontation, no raised voices. People found reasons gradually to collect their coats. Warren came to find me before he left, pressed my hand briefly, and said something quiet that I will keep to myself. 2 of the church women who had known my mother for decades left without seeking her out for a goodbye, which, in the language of that community, was a statement. Renata cornered me briefly near the coat rack. Her fiancé was a few steps behind her with an expression suggesting he deeply wished he were elsewhere. She said, "You didn't have to do that here." I said, "I didn't plan it for here. The moment presented itself." She said, "Mom is devastated." I looked at her for a moment. I said, "She seemed calm." Renata opened her mouth and then closed it again, and her fiancé gently touched her elbow, and they left. Gerald found me outside by my car afterward. He handed me the folder. He said, "You did fine." I said I wasn't sure I'd done it right. He said, "There is no right. There's honest and there's quiet. You did both." In the days that followed, the calls began. My mother called the evening of the anniversary. I did not answer. She called the next morning. I did not answer. She called the following 3 evenings in a row, and on the 4th call I answered, because I had already spoken to Ellen by then and knew where I stood. My mother said, "Nadia, I think there's been a misunderstanding about how the finances worked." I said I didn't think there had been a misunderstanding. I said I had the transfer records and Gerald had the medical records, and together they told a complete story. She said, "Your father's care was expensive in ways that aren't always captured by official records. There were costs we managed privately." I said, "Mom, I'm not angry, but I also won't pretend the numbers say something they don't say." She said, "We're your parents." I said, "I know that." There was a long silence. And then she said, "What are you going to do?" I told her what I had already done. The wire account was closed. Ellen had reviewed my options under civil statute for the recovery of funds transferred under false pretense, and I had made the decision, my decision, not Ellen's suggestion, mine, not to pursue legal recovery. Not because there wasn't a case. Ellen had been fairly direct about the strength of the documentation, but because the cost of spending years in civil litigation against my parents was one I was not willing to pay. Not in money. In the other kind. What I told my mother was this: the monthly transfers were over. They would not resume. I would continue to be present in my daughter's life as her grandmother in whatever way that relationship could be rebuilt on honest terms. But I would not be sending money, and I would not be the reserve account for the family's shortfalls going forward. My mother was quiet for a long time after that. Then she said, "We may need to look at things differently then." I said, "Yes, that seems right." My father called once, 3 weeks later. The call was short. He said, "I want you to know that I do have a heart condition." I said I believed him. He said, "The management of it has been complicated." I said I understood. He said, "I hope you'll think about what family means in the long run." I said I had been thinking about very little else.
He said goodbye.
I said goodbye. That was the longest we had spoken, just the two of us in years. Renata's fiancé, I was told some months later through a mutual family connection, had asked some fairly direct questions about the loan his family had extended for the anniversary party after the events of that afternoon. The loan was, apparently, to have been repaid within 6 months. The conversations about that repayment did not go smoothly, and the engagement encountered a period of difficulty from which it slowly, reportedly, recovered, though on different terms. My parents did not take a vacation the following year, which I know because Renata mentioned it to me in one of our occasional, careful phone calls. She said it matter-of-factly, without accusation, and I received it the same way. I didn't engineer that outcome. I just stopped being the engine of it. What changed most was the quiet. For 6 years, even when my relationship with my parents was warm on the surface, there had been a current of something underneath every interaction, an awareness that I was carrying something they had never acknowledged. That current is gone now. The relationship is smaller. It is more honest. I cannot tell you yet whether the smaller, honest version will grow into something better, or whether it will stay the size it is now. I am keeping that question open. Gerald and I still talk every few weeks. The manila folder is in my filing cabinet in the section labeled Personal, Closed. Petra, who is 3.5 now, calls him Great-Grandpa Jerry and has decided his cane is a wizard staff, a characterization he tolerates with great dignity. Here is the thing I know now that I didn't know 6 years ago. Generosity is not the same as obligation, and love is not the same as a payment plan. I gave because I loved my parents and because I had been trained from childhood to believe that giving without question was the proof of that love. What I learned, finally, is that real love, the durable kind, the kind that outlasts a room going very quiet at an anniversary party, requires honesty to survive. A relationship built on one person's permanent, silent subsidy is not a relationship. It is a ledger. And eventually ledgers get audited. I am not bitter.
I want to say that plainly.
I am not standing in the wreckage of my family wishing I could go back. I am standing in a life I built, with a daughter who is healthy and curious and growing, and a grandfather who sits across from me at a kitchen table and tells me the truth, and a savings account that is growing instead of draining, and a very clear understanding of what I am willing to give and why. That understanding, earned at the cost of $252,000 and 6 years of unreceded faith, is not nothing. It might, in the long run, be everything. That's my story. A spreadsheet, a manila folder, and a room full of people who finally heard the same number I'd been living with for years. Here's what I want to ask you. Have you ever been the person in your family who just handles things, the one who absorbs the shortfall, covers the gap, and never asks for a receipt? Did you stay quiet because you loved them, or because you didn't yet know the difference between love and obligation? Drop your answer in the comments because I think more of you have been in this chair than anyone talks about. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.